Jasmine Crockett flew 800 miles to stand with a Kentucky family whose small farm was facing foreclosure after a federal agency, under a directive backed by Senator Rand Paul, rezoned their land as a critical buffer zone, rendering it commercially worthless overnight. Within an hour of her impromptu press conference, the clip was an unstoppable digital wildfire. On social media, the image of the Texas Congresswoman, dressed in a sharp blazer, bending down to let a stream of dry Kentucky soil run through her fingers, became an instant symbol. #TheftOvaHeritage and #Stand with Web Farm exploded, eclipsing cable news, punditry, and dominating the national conversation. News channels, which had previously ignored the story, now played the 45-second clip on a loop, the raw power of her statement cutting through the usual political static. In Washington, D.C., and particularly in the offices of the junior senator from Kentucky, aides scrambled in a state of escalating panic, realizing the sterile, dismissive press release they had issued just minutes earlier had become the fuel for a political firestorm they were completely unprepared to fight. 40-8 hours earlier. The issue was nothing more than a ghost on a spreadsheet for Senator Rand Paul. He sat in his quiet study in Bowling Green, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the distinct, ordered silence of a man confident in his worldview. Before him lay a summary of legislative impacts from the Secure Communications Infrastructure Act, a bill he had championed and successfully inserted into a larger omnibus package months ago. He saw it as a triumph of foresight. The act identified key federal communication hubs across the country, nodes critical for national security, and authorized the Department of Homeland Security to establish protected zones around them to prevent electronic interference or potential physical threats. It was clean, logical, and, in his assessment, a constitutionally sound exercise of the federal government's duty to provide for the common defense. An aide had flagged a minor issue a week prior. "Senator, we're getting some feedback on the buffer zone implementation around the Bluegrass Relay Hub. There's a farm, the web property, that's been significantly impacted by the rezoning." Paul had barely looked up. "What's the acreage?" The aide, a young man named Philip, had the data ready. 112 acres, sir. It's a multi-generational family farm. The rezoning designation as a no-build, no-till zone effectively makes their land commercially not. They can't farm it, can't build on it, can't use it as collateral for their agricultural loans. The bank is moving to foreclose. Paul had processed the information with the detached precision of a surgeon. The hub is a critical asset. Its security is paramount. The family will be entitled to a fair market value compensation, as stipulated by law. It's an unfortunate but necessary outcome. Is there anything else? Philip had hesitated. They claim the fair market value assessment is based on the land's value after the rezoning, which is next to nothing. They're calling it a taking. Paul had finally looked at Philip, a hint of intellectual impatience in his eyes. It's not a taking, it's a regulation. The law is the law. They can appeal through the administrative process. This is the cost of a secure society. Let the process work. For the senator, the matter was closed, a tidy equation where national security outweighed individual inconvenience. He saw the webs not as people, but as a data point in a successful policy implementation. In a cramped, brightly lit office in the Cannon House office building, Jasmine Crockett was reading the same story from the other end of the telescope. It wasn't a spreadsheet to her. It was a 4-paragraph article from the Lexington Herald Leader that her legislative aide, a tenacious 26-year-old named Maria, had flagged with a yellow digital sticky note. "Representative Crockett, you need to see this. This is a public defender's case." The headline was simple: "Local family fights foreclosure after federal rezoning." Crockett read it, then read it again. She clicked on the embedded links, pulling up the county property records. The Webb family, owners of that parcel since 1919, she saw the grainy photo of the patriarch, a man named Samuel Webb, his face a mask of weary defiance, standing by a rusted fence post. The story detailed how the family had received a certified letter from a DHS subagency informing them that 98 of their 112 acres now fell within a critical communications buffer zone. They were prohibited from using heavy machinery, from planting crops taller than 3 feet, and from building any new structures. The rezoning had triggered a covenant in their long-standing agricultural loan, and the bank, seeing the land as worthless collateral, had initiated foreclosure proceedings. Crockett leaned back, the leather of her chair groaning. This wasn't just policy. It was a death sentence for a family's legacy, delivered in a manila envelope. Her mind, trained over years as a public defender in Bowie County, started dissecting the injustice. She saw the power imbalance, the impenetrable wall of bureaucracy designed to crush individuals like the Webbs. "Maria," she called out, her voice sharp, "get me everything you can on the Secure Communications Infrastructure Act. I want to know who sponsored it, who voted for it, and I want the exact language of the section on buffer zones. And find me a phone number for Samuel Webb." Within an hour, the documents were on her desk. The bill's champion was clear: Senator Rand Paul. Crockett saw the irony immediately. A man who had built his entire political brand on libertarian principles of individual freedom and limited government was the architect of a policy that was, in effect, seizing a family's land without meaningful compensation. Statements praising the bill as a necessary measure. She saw the legalese of the directive, a thicket of jargon designed to be incomprehensible, and then she made the call. A woman answered, her voice cautious. "Hello, hello. My name is Jasmine Crockett. I'm a U.S. Congresswoman from Texas. May I please speak with Mr. Samuel Webb?" There was a long silence filled with suspicion. "What is this about?" "I read about what's happening to your farm," Crockett said, her tone shifting from official to personal. "I used to be a public defender. I know a raw deal when I see one. I think I might be able to help." She was put on the phone with Samuel Webb. His voice was gravelly, worn down by stress, but with a core of stubborn pride. He explained the situation with no embellishment: the years of work, the sudden notice, the cold response from the bank, the feeling of utter helplessness. "We've called everyone," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Our own representatives. They send us forms to fill out. Senator Paul's office. They sent us a link to the law," he wrote. "It feels like we're just ants, and they've decided to pave over our hill." Crockett listened, her own resolve hardening with every word. This was exactly the kind of fight that got her into politics in the first place. It wasn't about left versus right. It was about right versus wrong. It was about power rolling over the powerless. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice clear and steady, "they are counting on you feeling like an ant. They are counting on you giving up. I'm not going to let that happen." She looked at her schedule on the monitor, a week packed with committee meetings and constituent calls. She clicked delete on all of it. "Don't say anything to the press. Don't sign anything. I'm coming to you." She hung up and looked at Maria. "Book me a commercial flight to Lexington first thing in the morning and get a rental car. And tell MICOM's director to put out a simple media advisory. We're holding a press conference." Location: the Webb family farm. The drive from Lexington's Bluegrass Airport was a rolling canvas of Kentucky's famed beauty. Experts and her own staff, absorbing information, sharpening her arguments. The key, she knew, was the Fifth Amendment's takings clause. Private property shall not be taken for public use. The government's trick, the one Paul's law had codified, was to call it a regulation instead of a taking. Finally turned onto the long gravel driveway of the Webb farm, the scene was exactly as she'd pictured it, only more fragile. The barn roof sagged slightly in the middle. A small cluster of vehicles was parked in the yard to local news vans and a car from the Associated Press. Samuel Webb was waiting on the porch. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 60s, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that held a lifetime of worry. Beside him stood his wife, Sarah, a woman with a quiet, unshakable strength, and their son, David, a young man in his 20s who had come home from college to help fight for the farm. Crockett got out of the car and walked straight to them, extending a hand. "Samuel, I'm Jasmine Crockett. It's an honor to meet you." The handshake was firm, a silent transfer of trust. She wasn't a politician descending from on high. She was an ally arriving for a fight. We didn't know who else to turn to. You turned to the right place," Crockett replied, looking him squarely in the eye. "Now, let's go show them they can't just erase you." The press conference began simply. Crockett, flanked by the 3 members of the Webb family, stood before the handful of microphones. She began not with fire, but with facts. She spoke as the lawyer she was, laying out the case with methodical precision. "Good morning. We are standing on Webb Farm. This land has been worked by the Webb family for 106 years. 4 generations have planted crops in this soil, raised families in that house, and contributed to this community," she said, gesturing toward the farmhouse. 6 weeks ago, under a provision in the Secure Communications Infrastructure Act, a law authored and championed by Senator Rand Paul, the federal government designated 98 acres of this land as a critical buffer zone. This designation, which came with no public hearing and no direct consultation, prohibits the Webb family from farming their own land. She held up a document. This is the notice of foreclosure from their bank, which rightly concluded that land which cannot be used has no value as collateral. The government has offered compensation based on this new worthless valuation. This is not a transaction. It is an eviction notice wrapped in bureaucratic red tape. Paul is known as a fierce defender of property rights. Isn't it possible this is just an unforeseen consequence of a necessary national security law? Crockett nodded. That is the central question, isn't it? And it's why I am here. Because property rights and constitutional principles aren't abstract talking points to be used in speeches. They are real protections for real people. They are meant to be a shield for families like the Webbs against this exact kind of government overreach. It was then that a national reporter who had been scrolling on his phone looked up. He cleared his throat, a signal that the dynamic was about to shift. "Congresswoman Crockett, I have a statement that was just emailed to the press from Senator Paul's office." A hush fell over the small crowd. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their buzzing. The Webb family tensed, their faces drawn. The reporter read from his phone, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. While the senator sympathizes with any citizen impacted by federal regulations, the Secure Communications Infrastructure Act is a vital tool for national security. The designation of the land in question was a necessary administrative matter, handled by the appropriate agency. The involvement of a representative from Texas in a local Kentucky issue appears to be an act of performative political tourism. Administrative matter. Performative political tourism. The insult was twofold: a cold dismissal of the family's life's work and a direct personal attack on her. Crockett could feel Sarah Webb flinch beside her. She saw the flash of anger and despair in David's eyes. Samuel Webb just stared at the ground, his jaw tight. Crockett didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, allowing the cruelty of the statement to fully land. She saw the camera zoom in, waiting for the explosion. Instead, she looked down at the dry, cracked earth beneath her feet. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down, her movements fluid and unhurried. The cameras followed her. She scooped up a handful of the dusty brown soil. She stood up, holding it in her palm, and looked straight into the lens of the nearest camera, bypassing the reporters entirely, as if speaking directly to the senator himself. "Senator Paul's office calls this a matter," she began, her voice low but carrying an immense weight. She let the soil begin to run through her fingers, each grain a testament to a century of labor. "The Webb family," she continued, her voice rising with controlled passion, "calls it their life, a look of profound solidarity passing between them." Then, back to the camera. "He can tweet about freedom from Washington." She paused, letting the last of the dirt fall from her hand, leaving a dusty residue on her palm. The moment was hers, and she seized it. Due process isn't a suggestion, it's a right. Property rights, which the senator claims to cherish, aren't just for corporations with lobbyists. They are for families like the Webbs, who have only their name and their history to stand on. "So I have a message for the senator." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "I invite you to come down here. Leave your D.C. office, get in your car, and drive down this road. Stand on this land, look this family in the eye, and tell them their life is just an administrative matter. Tell them their heritage is just the cost of doing business. I'll wait." She held the gaze for a beat longer, a silent challenge that echoed louder than any shout. Then she turned not to the press, but to the Webb family. She put a firm, reassuring hand on Samuel's shoulder. "We're done here," she said quietly, for them alone to hear. She gave a single sharp nod to the stunned reporters, turned her back on the cameras, and walked with the family toward the farmhouse, leaving a tableau of open-mouthed journalists and the lingering, powerful image of a warrior who had just chosen her battlefield and fired the first devastating shot. Inside the farmhouse, the sudden quiet was jarring. The roar of the reporters' departing vehicles was replaced by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Sarah Webb pressed a glass of cold water into Jasmine Crockett's hand, her own hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, Sarah," whispered, the two words carrying the weight of a family's desperation. Samuel Webb stood by the window, watching the dust settle on the driveway. "No one has ever stood up for us like that, ever." Crockett took a sip of water. "This is just the first step, Samuel. The fight gets harder from here. They're going to come after me, and they're going to try to discredit you. You need to be ready for that." Silent and watchful throughout the ordeal, finally spoke, his voice filled with a newfound energy. He looked at Crockett, not with awe, but with the focused gaze of a student learning a vital lesson. "What you did out there, you used their own words against them. You turned their attack into a weapon." Crockett nodded, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "That's the only way to fight bullies. You don't let them set the terms of the debate." She finished the water and handed the glass back to Sarah. "We're going to file for an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure. We'll challenge the constitutionality of the designation itself, but for now, you need to hold tight. Don't talk to anyone else. Let the statement I made do its work." The drive back to the airport was a blur of motion and digital noise. As soon as her rental car hit the main road, Crockett's phone began to vibrate incessantly. It was a deluge. Her chief of staff, Marcus, was the first call she took. "Jasmine, what the hell did you do? You're the lead story. On CNN, Fox News, AP, everywhere. I told the truth, Marcus. Is the video out?" "Is it out?" He laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Jasmine, it's a nuke. The clip of you with the soil is already at 5 million views on one platform alone. Hashtag theft of heritage is the #1 trend in the United States. Your move is being compared to the Sir. You've yet to have the decency moment. It's that big." Crockett navigated a turn, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She felt no elation, only the cold, sharp focus of a strategist who has successfully executed a higher-risk maneuver. What's the chatter from Paul's office? Total silence, which tells you everything. They're in a bunker. There comes. Director's inbox probably just melted. "Jasmine, you made it the anchor around his neck. Every single host is using it to frame his hypocrisy." Chirons flashed with escalating intensity. Crockett accuses Paul of theft of heritage in viral confrontation. On cable news, it's only about principles until it's their constituents paying the price. On another network, a conservative host looked conflicted, but the image of a family's land being rendered worthless by a federal mandate. That's a tough look for any conservative. The memesmiths of the internet were already at work. The image of Crockett letting the soil fall from her hand was being photoshopped into historic scenes of protest. Her words were plastered over images of the Webb's farmhouse. That had cut through the noise and created a clear, understandable narrative. A powerful senator had hurt a simple family, and a congresswoman from 800 miles away had shown up to fight for them. The backlash from Paul's camp, when it finally began to trickle out, was clumsy and defensive. Surrogates sent onto news programs tried to pivot to talk about the importance of the communications hub, about national security, about the letter of the law. But no one was listening. Paul's sterile academic arguments were being drowned out by the raw, emotional power of the story Crockett had framed. His office had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed the battle would be fought on paper, in the realm of statutes and administrative procedure. But as she walked through the terminal, her head down, a baseball cap pulled low, the triumph felt distant. The vibrations from her phone were no longer just from staff and news alerts. A different, darker tide was rising. She took a cab not to her apartment, but to a quiet hotel nearby. A practiced move for when a story blew up and her personal space became a target. Inside the anonymous hotel room, with its beige walls and generic art, the adrenaline of the day finally drained away. Leaving a profound and heavy exhaustion in its place, she kicked off her shoes, tossed her blazer onto a chair, and sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed. She opened her phone. First, she looked at the public-facing comments on her social media. The support was a roaring wave, thousands of messages praising her courage. But interwoven with it was a venom that was deeply familiar and yet always shocking. The messages were a torrent of filth. Racist slurs were flung with casual cruelty, misogynistic threats, detailed acts of violence. Her personal information, though outdated, was being shared in dark corners of the web. "Watch your back in D.C. We know where your district office is. You're a race-baiting witch who deserves what's coming to you," she scrolled, through with the practiced attachment of a bomb disposal expert, identifying threats, forwarding the worst of them to her chief of staff for reporting, and building the mental wall that allowed her to function. This was the tax, the price of speaking out while black and female in an arena dominated by powerful white men. It wasn't the anger that got to her. It was the sheer volume, the dehumanizing force of it all. For a moment, sitting alone in the silent room, she felt the immense weight of the hatred directed at her. It felt less like a political disagreement and more like a primal cultural immune response from a segment of the country that saw her very existence in the halls of power as a threat. The phone rang, and the caller ID was a beacon of warmth in the digital cesspool. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and answered, "Hello, Mom. Jasmine Felicia Crockett. What in the world have you gotten yourself into now?" Her mother's voice was a familiar blend of Southern matriarchal sternness, deep pride, and an undercurrent of unshakable worry. Jasmine tried for levity. "Just another day at the office, Mom. Stirring up a little good trouble. Don't you good trouble me," her mother shot back, though there was no real heat in it. "I saw the clip. The whole world has seen the clip. Your Aunt Carol called me from Dallas, said she saw it on her lunch break. You were powerful, baby. You stood there like you were 10 feet tall." There was a pause. "But I also see the things they're saying about you online. It worries me, Jasmine. It worries me sick." The carefully constructed wall inside Crockett crumbled just a little. "It's ugly, Mom," she admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's always ugly." "Then why, baby? Why put yourself in the middle of it?" "A fight in Kentucky, of all places." Crockett closed her eyes, and the image of Samuel Webb's face flashed in her mind. The despair, the helplessness, the flicker of hope when she'd arrived. "Because they were going to be erased," she said, her voice firming up again, the purpose of the day flooding back in. "That family, you should have seen their faces. The system was designed to make them invisible, to make them give up and disappear. They followed every rule, and the rules were still written to make them lose. If I don't fight for them, who will? If I have this platform and I don't use it for people like them, then what is the point of any of it?" There was a long sigh. On the other end of the line, it was a sigh of understanding, of resignation, of a mother's fierce and reluctant pride. I know that's who you are, but you promise me you'll take a breath. Promise me you'll be careful. Let your people handle it. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. Knew how to operate." "All right then," her mother said, her voice softening. "Now, did you eat any dinner?" The question, so simple, so maternal, was the pin that finally popped the bubble of tension. Crockett laughed, a genuine, tired laugh. "No, Mom, I haven't." "Well, you order something right now. You can't. Fight the power on an empty stomach." "I love you." "I love you too, Mom." She hung up the phone and stared at the blank TV screen. The threats were still waiting on her phone. The political battle would be raging in the morning. The work on the legal case had just begun. But the conversation had been an anchor. It had reminded her of the world outside the Beltway, of the values instilled in her long before she ever walked into the Capitol. The fight was public, but the fuel was private. It came from a place of deep conviction, a place her mother understood, without needing to have it explained. But her mother was right. Senator Paul's office, having recovered from the initial shock, mounted a disciplined but tone-deaf counteroffensive. The senator himself appeared on a friendly cable news network, seated in front of a backdrop of books, looking more like a university professor than a politician under siege. He spoke at length about the critical nature of the Bluegrass Relay Hub, using technical jargon about data redundancy and signal integrity. He argued, with academic coolness, that the law was applied fairly and that the administrative process for compensation was robust. Family in question should pursue that remedy, not resort to political theater. His strategy was clear: to drag the conversation away from the dirt of the Webb farm and back into the sterile, abstract realm of policy and procedure, where he was most comfortable. His allies picked up the talking points, flooding op-ed pages and conservative talk radio with arguments about the rule of law and the dangers of activist representatives, interfering in matters outside their jurisdiction. But it wasn't working. The image of Crockett holding the soil was branded onto the public consciousness. Every time Paul's surrogates mentioned the administrative process, news channels would show the clip of Samuel Webb's weary face, a living rebuttal to their sterile arguments. The hashtag theft of heritage had become a stubborn barnacle on Paul's political ship, impossible to scrape off. Crockett's office, meanwhile, remained strategically quiet. Legally sound, but also served to keep the story grounded in the courthouse rather than the cable news studio. They let the image and the initial statement do the work, refusing to be drawn into a daily back and forth that would dilute its power. Crockett knew that to speak again, she needed the right moment. The battle had reached a stalemate. Paul couldn't regain control of the narrative, and Crockett was waiting for the terrain to shift. The shift came not from a politician, but from a living legend of the conservative movement. Jedediah Jedstone was a columnist and author in his late 70s, a man whose intellectual lineage traced back to William F. Buckley, Jr. He was a fierce anti-communist. He had spent 50 years championing the pillars of American conservatism: fiscal restraint, a strong national defense, and, above all, the sacrosanct nature of private property. He wrote from his farm in rural Virginia, rarely appeared on television, and viewed most of modern Washington with a jaundiced eye. He had never once, in his long career, written a single positive word about a progressive Democrat. His syndicated weekly column, which ran in over 200 newspapers across the country, was required reading for anyone who took conservative thought seriously. When Stone's column dropped on the following Thursday morning, the title was simple: On Soil and Sovereignty. It began as his readers expected. The junior senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, finds himself besieged by the predictable furies of the progressive left. Led in this instance by a Texas Congresswoman, Jasmine Crockett, he wrote, "I have studied the Congresswoman's record. On matters of economics, regulation, and the role of government, she and I stand on opposite sides of a philosophical abyss. My life to opposing, and yet, on the specific matter of the Webb family and their 100 acres of Kentucky farmland, it is Congresswoman Crockett who is standing on conservative ground, while Senator Paul has wandered into a wilderness of bureaucratic abstraction." Paragraph was a political earthquake. In newsrooms and campaign offices across D.C., people read it again to make sure they hadn't misread it. Stone continued, building his case not with emotion, but with the foundational principles of the philosophy he had long championed. The senator and his defenders speak of the law. Act is, indeed, the law. But not all laws are just, and not all regulations are righteous. The conservative tradition, from Locke to Kirk, understands that liberty is not a gift from the state, but a right from God, and that this liberty finds its most tangible expression in the ownership of property. A man's land is his domain, an extension of his person and his labors. When the state, by legislative fiat, destroys the economic value of that land, it is performing a taking, in fact, regardless of the legal gymnastics used to avoid the label. To tell a man he still owns his land after you have forbidden him from using it is a semantic cruelty. It is the logic of a tyrant, not a constitutionalist. Stone then aimed his sights directly at Paul's core identity. Senator Paul is a son of the libertarian movement, which purports to value individual freedom above all, the lived reality of the people it claims to represent. It has become a sterile academic exercise in maximizing theoretical liberties, often at the expense of the actual, tangible traditions and properties of working families. Senator Paul argues for national security. It is a noble cause, but a nation that secures its communication hubs by rendering its own citizens insecure in their homes and on their land is not a nation that is truly safe. It is merely a nation that has perfected the mechanisms of its own power. The column's conclusion was devastating. I do not know what motivated Congresswoman Crockett to fly to Kentucky. Her defenders will call it compassion. Her detractors call it opportunism. It may well be both. But the substance of her argument, distilled from the political theater, is this: the Webb family's heritage was stolen by a penstroke in Washington. She is right. Senator Paul, a man I have often admired for his courage, has in this case traded the foundational principle of property rights for the cold logic of the security state. He has erred, and it is the duty of his fellow conservatives to say so. Lest we allow progressives to become the sole defenders of the most conservative principle of all, the right to one's own land, the effect was immediate and profound. The dam broke. On the Sunday morning talk shows, the debate was no longer about Crockett. It was about Paul and the meaning of conservatism. A Republican senator, a colleague of Paul's from a neighboring state, was asked about the column. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, Jed Stone is a powerful voice," he began, choosing his words carefully. "And I do think there are valid questions that have been raised about the implementation of this law. We need to ensure that when we act to protect national security, we are not unduly burdening our own citizens. The property rights issue is a serious one." It was all the opening the media needed. The narrative shifted from a partisan fight to an ideological civil war within the Republican Party. They had read Stone's column. They wanted to know what the senator was going to do to fix this. In her office, Crockett read the column with her team. Maria was ecstatic. "This is it. This is the key. He just unlocked the entire other side of the debate for us. We're fighting on Jed Stone's turf." Marcus, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking 5 steps ahead. This changes the endgame. Paul can't just wait this out anymore. The pressure from his own flank is going to be immense. He's going to have to make a move. The question is, what's ours? Crockett stared at the screen, at Jed Stone's severe black-and-white author photo. He had not endorsed her. He had, in fact, explicitly insulted her political philosophy. But he had done something far more valuable. He had validated the principle of her argument in a language her opponents could not ignore. He had taken her theft of heritage line and translated it into the King's English of the conservative movement. He had given her an unimpeachable witness. She knew her moment was coming. The stalemate was broken. The ground had shifted decisively. Paul was now wounded, isolated, and fighting a battle on 2 fronts. Her next public statement couldn't be a repeat of the first. It couldn't be just emotional. It had to be the final definitive word. It had to be a statement not just of advocacy, but of victory. "Get me the legal team on a conference call," she said to Maria, a new fire in her eyes. "And Marcus, start looking for a venue. Not a press conference, not an interview. Something else, something with more weight. I'm going to end this, on my terms." The week following Jedediah Stone's column was one of slow, grinding pressure for Senator Rand Paul. The battle had moved from the open field of media combat to a grueling, close-quarters siege of his own office. The phones, which had initially rung with the furious calls of Crockett's supporters, now carried the measured, concerned tones of his own people. A real estate developer in Louisville, a major donor, called to say that the optics of the web situation were making it difficult to defend property rights initiatives locally. The head of a Kentucky Cattlemen's Association, a man who had endorsed Paul in every election, emailed a clipped note. "Senator, my members are worried. If they can do this to the webs, they can do it to any of us." Paul found himself in an ideological box of his own making. He sat with Philip, his young aide, in his Senate office, Stone's column printed out on the desk between them, marked, "Up," with Paul's angry scrawled rebuttals in the margins. "The entire premise is intellectually dishonest," Paul said, tapping the paper. "Stone is conflating a legitimate targeted security regulation with broad-based land confiscation. They're 2 completely different categories of state action. He knows it, but he'd rather score points with his agrarian readership than engage in a serious legal debate." Philip, looking pale and exhausted, decided to risk it. "Sir, with respect, I don't think people are parsing the legal categories. They see a family farm, and they see the government making it worthless. Jed Stone just gave them the intellectual permission to side with the farm. Maybe we could introduce an amendment process for these specific buffer zones. We could name it after the Webb family, frame it as a responsive solution." Paul's eyes narrowed. "Absolutely not. We will not legislate based on slogans and media pressure campaigns. The policy is sound. The administrative remedy is in place." To backtrack now would be to concede the premise that the initial act was unjust, which it was not. It was necessary. We will hold the line. But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Holding the line felt less like a principled stand and more like a lonely losing battle. He was an island of pure logic in an ocean of what he considered to be irrational emotion, and the tide was rising, while Paul was fortifying his island. Jasmine Crockett was planning her invasion. She and her team were huddled in her office, brainstorming. The idea of another press conference was immediately dismissed. An interview on a friendly network felt too predictable. "This can't just be a response," Marcus said, pacing in front of a whiteboard. "It has to be the definitive last word. It needs a sense of permanence. It needs weight." Maria, who had been quietly researching on her laptop, looked up. American University's Washington College of Law is hosting its annual Law and a Free Society Symposium in 3 days. Their keynote speaker, a federal judge, just withdrew due to a family emergency. They're scrambling. Crockett leaned forward, intrigued. "A law school." Marcus stopped, pacing. "It's perfect. It's not a partisan venue. It's academic. It's serious. It allows you to reframe this whole thing. You're not just a politician. You're an officer of the court, a lawyer, speaking to future lawyers about a fundamental constitutional question. You can deliver a legal masterclass that doubles as a political checkmate." Crockett smiled. "Make the call, Maria. Tell them I can fill in." 3 days later, Jasmine Crockett stood at a lectern in a packed auditorium at the American University Law School. There were no campaign signs, no cheering crowds. The audience was composed of law students, professors, and a gallery of D.C. legal scholars. The C-SPAN cameras were there, their presence lending a quiet gravity to the proceedings. She began, not with a fiery salvo, but with the calm, measured tone of a professor beginning a lecture. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice resonating through the hall. "I want to thank Dean Reynolds and the faculty for inviting me. I know my presence here is a bit last minute, and it comes in the midst of a rather noisy public debate. I don't intend to add to that noise today. Instead, I want to talk about a question that is fundamental to everything you will do in your careers. It is the central question of our republic. What is the proper relationship between the citizen and the state in a free society?" She let the question hang in the air. She did not mention Kentucky, the Webbs, or Senator Paul. "Our Constitution," she continued, "is not merely a grant of power to the government. It is, more profoundly, a charter of limitations on that power. It is a document that says to the state, here you may go, but no further. And perhaps no limitation is more fundamental, more essential to the concept of individual liberty than the one enshrined in the Fifth Amendment, that private property shall not be taken for public use." "Without just compensation," she began, to walk the students through the legal history, her voice a precise instrument. She spoke of the founders' fear of an all-powerful state capable of dispossessing its citizens at will. She explained the evolution of regulatory takings, jurisprudence, citing cases and legal tests with the easy familiarity of someone who lived with these concepts for years. The government will often argue, as it has in a recent well-publicized case, that a regulation is not a taking. They will claim that because the owner retains the title to the land, nothing has been taken. But this is a distinction without a difference. It is a legal fiction. If the government passes a rule that eliminates 100% of a property's economic value, they tell you that you can no longer farm your land, build on your land, or borrow against your land, have they not, in fact, taken it? They have taken its utility, its value, its very essence. They have left the owner with nothing but a tax bill and a worthless deed. To call that anything less than a taking is an insult to the English language and an assault on the spirit of the Fifth Amendment. The students were rapt furiously taking notes. The professors nodded in appreciation of her clear, methodical argument. "This is not, and has never been, a partisan issue," she declared, her voice gaining strength. "It is a constitutional one. It is a question of whether the rights enshrined in our founding documents are a vibrant, living shield for every citizen, or merely a set of suggestions the government can waive when it becomes inconvenient. The belief that property rights are fundamental is not an exclusively conservative or libertarian idea. It is an American one. It is a promise we make to each other that the fruits of your labor, the home you build, the land you inherit, will not be rendered meaningless by a distant and unaccountable bureaucracy. Now she pivoted, bringing the lecture to its powerful conclusion. In recent weeks, I became involved in the case of one family, the Webbs of Kentucky. But their story is not unique. All across this country, citizens find themselves entangled in webs of regulation, so complex, so opaque, that they are left with no recourse. They are told to trust the process, even when the process is designed for them to fail. They are told their sacrifice is for the greater good, even when the sacrifice is total and the good is abstract. This is where the law must be more than just a set of rules. It must be a vessel for justice. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the auditorium. It was time to deliver the final blow. The senior senator from Kentucky, a man of considerable intellect for whom I have a great deal of professional respect, was the author of the law that ensnared the Webb family. He has argued, with conviction, that his actions were legally sound and necessary for the security of our nation. He is a man who speaks often and eloquently about liberty. But it seems to me that in this instance, he has confused the theoretical liberty of the Commonwealth with the tangible liberty of the citizen. Senator Paul was wrong. He was wrong not just on the policy, but on the principle. And in a representative democracy, when our leaders are wrong, it is the duty of the citizens and their other elected representatives to hold them accountable. She took a breath, letting the direct naming of her adversary settle in the room. The fight for the Webb farm is more than a fight for one family. It is a reminder that our rights are not self-executing. They must be defended in courtrooms, in communities, and in the halls of Congress. It is a reminder that the most powerful words in our civic life are not found in statutes or regulations, but in the first 3 words of our Constitution, we, the people. She finished speaking. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the auditorium erupted. It was not the wild cheering of a political rally, but a sustained, resounding ovation of respect. Students, professors, even the usually staid legal scholars were on their feet. Jasmine Crockett had done more than win a news cycle. She had won the argument. The speech was a checkmate. It was too substantive to be dismissed as theater, too legally sound to be refuted on the merits. The clips that played on the news that evening weren't just of her impassioned plea on the farm. They were of her in the law school auditorium, coolly and methodically dismantling her opponent's entire case. The narrative was set in stone. The political pressure on Senator Paul became unbearable. His office was flooded with calls from fellow Republicans urging him to resolve the issue. The White House, seeing a needless political firestorm, signaled its displeasure through back channels. 2 weeks after Crockett's speech at the university, the inevitable happened. The Department of Homeland Security, in a dry press release, announced it was conducting a full and immediate review of the designated buffer zone surrounding the Bluegrass Relay Hub, citing concerns raised by community stakeholders and members of Congress. The agency announced a temporary suspension of the regulation's enforcement pending the review. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a full, unconditional surrender. That evening, Jasmine Crockett sat in her quiet D.C. apartment, the television off. Her phone rang. The caller ID read, Samuel Webb. She answered with a smile in her voice. Mr. Webb, I saw the news. Congratulations. There was a choked sob on the other end of the line. Congresswoman Samuel Webb said, his voice thick with tears, the bank called an hour ago. The regional manager, he apologized. Can you believe that? He apologized. The foreclosure is canceled. They're restructuring our loan. We have our farm back. He broke down completely, a lifetime of stress and fear pouring out in a flood of grateful tears. You saved, U.S. Congresswoman, you saved our history. How can we ever thank you? Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past month washing over her, replaced by a profound sense of purpose fulfilled. You don't have to thank me, Samuel, she said softly. Just stay on that land, farm it, pass it down. To your son, that's all the thanks I need. You just live your life. We took care of the rest. The glare of the national spotlight receded as quickly as it had arrived. Within a week, the Webb Farm saga was old news, replaced in the relentless 24-hour news, cycled by a looming government shutdown and a brewing international crisis. The trending hashtags faded, the cable news debates moved on, and the army of online commentators both friendly and hostile, turned their attention to new targets. For Jasmine Crockett, life returned to the familiar, grinding rhythm of a congresswoman's daily work. The grand televised battle for constitutional principle was replaced by the unglamorous reality of governing. A 4-hour Agriculture Committee meeting on crop insurance subsidies, a tense negotiation with a Republican colleague over language, in a transportation bill, and a long afternoon spent on constituent services, making calls about a delayed VA benefit check for a veteran in Dallas and a passport issue for a family trying to travel abroad. The victory in Kentucky felt both monumental and strangely distant. It existed as a file on her office server, a collection of press clippings and legal documents. The real work, she knew, was not in the single dramatic win, but in the slow, incremental effort that rarely, if ever, made headlines. Yet, something had subtly shifted. In the hallways of the Capitol, colleagues from both parties looked at her differently. There was a new level of respect, an acknowledgement that she was not just a firebrand, but a formidable strategist who could win a fight. On terrain not of her own choosing, the most telling sign of the shift came from its source. In a Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing, nearly a month to the day after Crockett's visit to the farm, a debate arose over a new proposed rule that would grant federal agencies broad authority to restrict land use near critical infrastructure. A freshman senator from the opposing party, eager to make a point, questioned the provision. Referencing the recent controversy, he directed his question to the committee's chair, Senator Rand Paul. All eyes in the room turned to Paul. The old Paul would have launched into a robust defense of the government's authority. He would have been intellectually dismissive of the question, but the man who answered was different. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at his notes, and spoke with a new, cautious deliberation. "The senator raises a crucial point," Paul said, his voice even. "While the security of our national infrastructure is a paramount concern, it is imperative that in executing our duties, we remain vigilant about the direct economic impact on individual property owners. There must be a clear, swift, and truly just compensation process, not merely a bureaucratic one that proves ruinous to the citizens we serve. The implementation of such regulations must be handled with the utmost care and precision." It was not an apology. It was not a concession. But, for those who had followed the Webb Farm affair, it was a seismic shift. He had absorbed the lesson. He had been beaten on the principle, and he knew it. He would never admit defeat, but he would quietly adjust his course. In the silent coded language of Washington, it was the final, unwritten chapter of Crockett's victory, but the most significant echo of that victory was not heard in the halls of Congress. It was felt 1,000 miles away in the dry desert heat of a small town in Arizona. Sarah Jenkins, the 45-year-old owner of the Main Street Diner, was sitting alone in a booth long after closing time. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hung in the air. In front of her was a letter from the town of Harmony Creek's zoning board. It informed her that under the new Main Street Revitalization Ordinance, she had 90 days to replace the entire front of her diner with a pre-approved facade of faux adobe and distressed wood, at an estimated cost of $30,000. For Sarah, it was a death sentence. Her diner, which she had inherited from her father, barely broke even most months. $30,000 was an impossible sum. She knew exactly what was happening. A powerful local developer who was on the zoning board was putting up a new, generic strip mall on the edge of town. The ordinance was designed to squeeze out the old businesses on Main Street, forcing them to sell their property to him for pennies on the dollar. It was a local story of power and greed, as old as time. Sarah felt utterly helpless, a single voice against a system rigged against her. Her plan was to call the developer's lawyer in the morning and accept his insultingly low offer. It was easier than fighting a battle she knew she would lose. Despondently, she scrolled through her phone, seeking any distraction. The national news she'd missed over the last few weeks, political stories, an algorithm, in its mysterious wisdom, surfaced a video. It was titled, "Jasmine Crockett's Speech on Property Rights." Curious, she tapped on it. It wasn't the viral clip from the farm that she had vaguely remembered seeing. This was different. It was a woman in a law school auditorium, speaking with a calm, steely precision. Sarah listened. She heard Crockett talk about the law not as a weapon for the powerful, but as a shield for the citizen. She heard her dismantle the argument that a regulation that destroys a business isn't a form of taking. When the government passes a rule that eliminates 100% of a property's economic value, they have taken its utility, its value, its very essence, Crockett said from the screen. To call that anything less than a taking is an insult to the English language. A jolt went through Sarah. That's it, she thought. That's exactly what they're doing to me. She kept listening, captivated. This is not, and has never been, a partisan issue. Crockett's voice continued from the phone. It is a constitutional one. It is a reminder that our rights are not self-executing. They must be defended. The despair that had settled in Sarah's heart like a cold stone began to dissolve, replaced by a slow-burning spark of anger, of indignation, of hope. The feeling of being an isolated victim vanished, replaced by the realization that her small, local struggle was part of a larger, fundamental American story. Jasmine Crockett's words had given her a name for the injustice she was facing. They had given her a framework. They had given her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a reason to fight. The next morning, Sarah Jenkins did not call the developer's lawyer. Instead, she walked to the town library and printed out a copy of the new ordinance and the public minutes from the zoning board meeting where it was passed. She went back to her diner and created a simple social media page, Save Harmony Creek's Main Street. She posted a photo of her father standing proudly in front of the diner in the 1980s. Next to the letter from the zoning board, she wrote a short, clear post. The town is trying to force us to pay $30,000 for a facelift we don't need and can't afford. This isn't revitalization. It's an eviction notice designed to push out local history for corporate greed. Then she picked up the phone. She called old Mr. Henderson, who owned the hardware store, and the Martinez sisters, who ran the small bookstore. "Did you get the letter from the town?" she asked them. "I saw a story about a farm in Kentucky, and I think we can fight this." She heard the weariness in their voices, but she also heard a flicker of interest. "This isn't just about my diner," she said, the words feeling powerful and true as she spoke them. "They are trying to erase the history of this street." 2 weeks later, the Harmony Creek Town Council held its monthly public meeting in the local high school gymnasium. The agenda was mostly routine, but at the end, during the public comment period, the council chairman looked out at the sparse crowd and was surprised to see a small group of people standing by the microphone. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward first. She was nervous. Her hands shook as she unfolded a piece of paper. But as she looked at the 5 men on the zoning board, their faces smug and dismissive, her fear hardened into resolve. Behind her stood Mr. Henderson and the Martinez sisters, and behind them a dozen other local residents who had seen her page and felt the same spark of indignation. She was no longer a single, helpless voice. She was the first of many. She leaned into the microphone, her voice clear and steady, echoing slightly in the cavernous gym. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I own the Main Street Diner." She paused, looking each of the board members in the eye. "And I'm here to talk about the theft of our heritage. What does it truly mean for a representative to fight for the people? Is it about party loyalty or standing up for a principle? No matter where the fight takes you. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.